You rely on this podcast to stay informed and connected with your local community, and we rely on you. Without listener support, this show simply wouldn't exist. Be a part of the team that makes this show possible by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute. Donate at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Diana Opong. August is right around the corner, and that means it's almost time to pack up the kids and send them back to school. But that's not the only excitement the school system is preparing for right now. Because while kids are hanging on to a few more weeks of summer, voters are getting ready to determine who will oversee Washington's public schools. The incumbent Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal, is facing two challengers in the primary on August 6th. Here to break down the race so far is Grace Deng, a reporter with the Washington State Standard. Grace, welcome back to Soundside. It's good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too.
So before we dive into the race, let's lay out some basics. What does the superintendent do day to day, and what are they responsible for?
Sure. Just to back up a bit and explain what the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction does, they're the primary state agency that oversees public education in Washington. So the office channels funding to schools, it implements state education laws, and it sets curriculum standards. The office can also request legislation, just like every other state agency, but it can't pass laws by itself. It needs the legislature. And so the superintendent oversees all of that. Reykdal has long said that the office comes with a bully pulpit, but limited power. It's a fair point. In Washington, the legislature determines how much money goes to schools, and then the school boards and districts decide how that money gets used. But his challengers, to a certain extent, disagree with the idea that the office has limited power. They believe it has more power than Reykdal is saying that it does.
And Reykdal has held the position since 2016 and led the department through the pandemic. He's endorsed by several Democratic lawmakers and politicians, including Governor Jay Inslee and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. What's his platform going into this race?
Yeah, well, his big thing is funding. For years, he's called on the legislature to spend more money on education, particularly special education, as well as more money to fund salaries for teachers and for paraeducators. It's worth noting that he's endorsed by the state's teachers union as well. The superintendent's race is officially nonpartisan, but Reykdal is a proud Democrat. He's a former Democratic state lawmaker. He's a big supporter of public money for public schools and LGBTQ plus rights. He's also a former board member of the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. He's really proud of the work that the state has done to support trade and community college education. At the same time, he spent a lot of time in debates defending the department's efforts during the pandemic, as you've mentioned. He's received criticism for refusing to acknowledge how bad pandemic learning loss is, and generally making excuses and minimizing other major issues like chronic absenteeism.
Reykdal is facing three challengers in the primary. Reed Saris, an educator, and David Olson, a Peninsula School Board member and banker. There's another contender, John Blair, who's also an educator, and he's run in every race since 2014. So let's start with Reed Saris. What's his background coming into the race?
Saris has never held elected office, but he's got a long history in education. He's a public schools teacher who founded a national education nonprofit called Equal Opportunity Schools, which is aimed at eliminating barriers in education for students of all backgrounds. He ran Equal Opportunity Schools for about a decade, and the nonprofit has worked with hundreds of schools in dozens of states, including Washington. It's also helped over 50,000 students access advanced coursework, so APs and IBs and the like. He stepped down and returned to teaching, this time at Rainier Beach High School in Seattle last fall before leaving to campaign. And he says he was encouraged by John King, Obama's Secretary of Education, to run for the position. So his work at a national nonprofit, as well as his time at Stanford, means he has a lot of support from national education leaders.
So how does Saris differ from Reykdal, and does he actually even need to differ from Reykdal? Do they have any similarities?
Yeah, so Saris is also a Democrat. A lot of what he believes aligns with Reykdal, but he, like Olson, who we'll talk about in a little bit, has been on the attack and arguing that Reykdal hasn't properly addressed learning loss, absenteeism, and all the other issues facing our schools. Saris's big focus is mental health. His big thing is pushing for universal mental health care access for all students. He believes that's the biggest issue in the race. He's always quoting the Healthy Youth Survey, which found last year that 15% of adolescents reported they seriously considered suicide. He often mentions that we haven't seen any agency-sponsored, he's referring to the OSPI agency-sponsored legislation to address this issue. He's also argued it's not about more funding, which is, of course, Reykdal's big thing. It's about how the funding is used. He said he wants to ensure the state won't divest from K-12 education, but he's also concerned that the funding model is hurting low-income students and students from rural schools. And he's arguing that we do need more funding, but we need to fix how funding is allocated and used first. Cyrus has also said he believes in inclusive schools, but he wants the office to focus on engaging in kids' academic success, mental health, and future opportunities instead of focusing so much on culture wars.
And what do we know about the other challenger, David Olson? He's endorsed by the Washington State Republican Party. What's his campaign approach?
Yeah, so Olson does often say it's a nonpartisan race, but at the end of the day, he is endorsed by the Republicans, and he aligns with the Republicans on issues like trans kids in sports and student protests. He's called student protests against U.S. aid to Israel anti-Semitic riots. That's his quote. And said he doesn't agree with trans athlete males competing against females, which is him referring to trans girls who compete in girls and women's sports. He's also a big believer in parental rights and notification of parents on pretty much everything going on inside a school. His biggest focus, though, is local control and school board control. He says he'd be a champion for the school districts and school boards to make the decisions they feel is best. He's also said on day one, he'd tell every school district in the state, you have local control, how can I help? Same thing goes for teachers. He thinks there's a lot of policies and regulations that are hindering teachers from doing their jobs, and he wants teachers to be able to do their jobs without those things that teachers are required to monitor, that he says don't have anything to do with teaching kids academic subjects.
And John Blair, what do we know about him? He's run in this race over a span of 20 years. How does he fit into all of this?
Yeah, he hasn't shown up at any of the debates. I haven't really spoken to him yet. That's really all I've got for you on that.
So he's not a candidate who is doing the same level of sort of outreach and campaigning as the others?
As far as I can tell, I think he said he wanted to be at the first OSPI debate, which was headed by the League of Women Voters, I believe. And he sent his well wishes, but he hasn't shown up to either of the debates that I've covered.
Okay, and he's a longtime educator, and I guess just to be frank, do you consider him, or is he considered a serious candidate for consideration for this role?
When you look at the campaign finance data, it looks like he hasn't raised any money or reported raising any money yet. So to be fair, probably not.
The last election was in 2020 during the early stages of the pandemic. And according to the OSPI report card and the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a number of issues emerged as a result of the pandemic, including delays in reading and math, mental health concerns, and dropping enrollment. Grace, how are candidates seeking to address the concerns, especially knowing that one candidate's like, it's because we don't have enough funding. Another candidate's like, we just need to do more with what we've got. And then there's the element of OSPA maybe doesn't have as much power as they think they do.
Reykdal has spent a lot of time defending the way that his agency navigated the pandemic, right? And I think it's important to note that OSPI was not in charge of closing the schools. The governor made that decision, right? But now Reykdal has to navigate through that decision. And so he's argued that issues like pandemic learning loss are not as bad as the numbers say they are. If you look at different numbers, for example, you'll say that the learning loss is actually better than it was in other states. He said that the school districts and the teachers did a really good job during the pandemic. He's strongly defended our school districts and our schools and our teachers in the way that they navigated the pandemic. Cyrus and Olson have said that Reykdal minimizes pandemic learning loss. He minimizes issues like chronic absenteeism. I mean, at one of the debates, Reykdal said chronic absenteeism partly has to do with kids staying home now that they're when they're sick, and parents who work from home, which again, that's not what Cyrus and Olson think. And that's not what a lot of parents think, right?
So what I'm hearing you say, Grace, is that it depends on how people are looking at it. Reykdal's like, hey, here's what I'm seeing and why, because he's been in the job for a while, so he's seen past, I think, sort of past patterns. And we've got these two newcomers, Olson and Saris, who are like, no, actually, it's not this. So they have a different view on what's happening and why it's happening, the reasoning for that. You covered a debate in early July hosted by the League of Education Voters and the Association of Washington Student Leaders. What are some moments that stood out to you?
Yeah, Reykdal was a loud supporter of LGBTQ plus rights and inclusive curriculum. He got very passionate about it, got a lot of virtual applause for it. It was a virtual debate. And he also called school privatization a cult. So, very strong language, very passionate about issues that tend to galvanize Democrats. Saris relied a lot on his past as a teacher to answer questions, referring to his personal experiences with overcrowding, mental health issues. He's talked about how he's had students who are suicidal and what it's like as a teacher to have to deal with that, and how teachers are somehow expected to handle that in an overcrowded classroom without the funding and the resources that they need. Olson attacked Reykdal a lot. He said he supports sustainable timber harvesting to fund capital construction projects. It's a big issue in the Department of Natural Resources race. That's a whole nother ballgame, though. He also said during the debate that he believes parents should have as much access as possible to their kids. And he said transportation and bus funding needs to be fixed, which I haven't heard the other candidates talk about as much.
From your reporting, how do you feel like this race is shaping up? What are you hearing from voters?
This race doesn't usually get this much attention, but the pandemic's impact has really galvanized a lot of people, especially, parents, of course. There were a lot more people than I expected there to be at the debate in July, especially since it was a work night. Parents are really concerned about learning loss. They're really concerned about their kids. They're concerned about their kids' safety. They're concerned about their kids' mental health. I think Saris and Olson are tapping into that. It's also worth noting Saris has raised about $370,000 to Reykdal's $240,000. Saris also got the Seattle Times endorsement. There's a lot of momentum behind him. But Reykdal narrowly beat his 2016 challenger, who, like Saris, was a former educator, had never held elective office, but had a lot of energy and support. So you never know.
Grace Deng is a reporter for the Washington State Standard. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Ballots need to be postmarked by August 6th or in a Dropbox by 8 p.m.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.